Doctors, what is the dumbest moment you've ever had with a patient who refused to believe basic biology? Story 1. I had a patient in his 20s who came in convinced his stomach was full of tiny tornadoes. Not gas, not cramps, actual tornadoes. He said he could feel them spinning clockwise. I tried explaining digestion. He cut me off and said he knew his own body better than textbook biology. When I showed him an anatomical diagram, he said diagrams were propaganda from big science. Then he asked if I could prescribe tornado blockers. I told him that wasn't real. He said, well, it should be because something is rotating in there. It was gas, just gas. But he left angrily, insisting the Weather Channel needed to investigate him. Story 2. A woman came in furious that her blood was changing colours. She held out her arm dramatically. I asked what she meant. She said she saw her veins turn green, and that meant her blood was turning alien. I told her veins look green through the skin because of light, not because her blood was green. She refused to accept it. She actually yelled at me for denying her transformation. When we drew her blood and showed her it was normal, she stared at the vial for a long time and said, "You switched it, lady." I barely had the energy to stand upright that day. I didn't have the strength to run a sci-fi conspiracy. Story 3. I had a patient who insisted your body refills with new bones every 7 years. He said his back hurt because his new set was growing in early. I explained that wasn't how bones worked. He argued that teeth fall out and grow back, so logically the rest of the skeleton should too. I told him adults only get one skeleton. He frowned like I had personally limited his potential. Then he asked if an early bone refill qualified for disability benefits. I told him no. He stormed out, muttering that the government was hiding replacement bones. Story 4. A teenager came in convinced he had caught pregnancy. His girlfriend was pregnant, and somehow he thought they could share symptoms through proximity. He said his stomach hurt, and that meant the baby had transferred its aura into him. I asked where he learned that. He said he figured it out because his dog copies his emotions, so why wouldn't he copy hers? I told him that was not how anything works. He argued that love should make biology flexible. After 3 attempts to explain chromosomes, I gave up and just told him he had indigestion. He accepted that diagnosis instantly. Somehow that made more sense to him than basic reproduction. Story 5. A grown adult man came in demanding a CT scan because he believed his left lung was jealous of the right one. He said he could feel the imbalance. I asked what symptoms he had. He said, vibes, left-sided vibes. He wanted us to console the lung so the right one wouldn't hog the oxygen. When I explained lungs don't experience jealousy, he actually said, maybe yours don't. But mine are emotional. I have never wanted to lie down on the exam floor more in my life. Story 6. I treated a woman who refused antibiotics because she believed her infection was a test. Not a test from her immune system, from the moon. She said the moon was trying to teach her resilience. I explained bacterial infections do not care about lunar phases. She insisted bacteria obey celestial cycles and antibiotics interrupt her personal growth. 2 days later, she came back with a raging fever. I told her we needed to start treatment immediately. She said fine, but tell the moon I passed. Story 7. A man came into urgent care claiming he had a broken heart. Not metaphorically, literally. He said he felt a pop near his chest, and that meant his heart had cracked in half. I asked if he had any chest trauma. He said, no, but my ex texted me last night, so something snapped. I ran tests. Everything was normal. He refused to believe it. He kept saying he could hear it rattle when he leaned forward. I told him that was impossible. He insisted I was ignoring emotional acoustics. Emotional acoustics! I wrote it in the note just so someone else could witness my pain. Story 8. I once had a patient who argued that fevers were optional. He said the human body only heats up if you agree to participate. I asked what he meant. He said he chose not to have a fever even though he was visibly sweating through his shirt. The thermometer said 102.8. He shook his head and said, "Nope, rejecting that." I said, "Your body isn't taking requests." He said, "Actually it is. I'm very in tune with myself." Then he fainted. His body disagreed. Story 9. A woman came into the ER crying because she thought her belly button closed wrong. She said it wasn't aligned with her energy axis. I looked at it. It was a normal belly button, completely normal. She insisted it used to face slightly northeast, and now it pointed west-southwest, which meant her organs had rotated. I told her belly buttons don't face directions like weather vanes. She became upset and said I clearly didn't specialize in naval anthropology. I don't think anyone does. Story 10. A patient came in convinced he was breathing wrong. He said he had used up too much air that week and needed to refuel. I asked what he meant. He said lungs have a quota and he felt like he was close to running out. I tried explaining how oxygen exchange works. He waved me off mid-sentence and said, "Look, I know my limits. I need a refill tank." When I told him there is no such thing, he stared at me like I was withholding secret lung technology. Then he tried to inhale deeply and said, "See, I'm hitting the bottom." It was anxiety, but he left convinced he narrowly avoided suffocation due to lazy lungs. Story 11. I once had a man in his 30s who proudly informed me he couldn't get sick because he doesn't believe in germs. He said germs only work if you mentally accept them. He came in coughing so hard he sounded like an engine. Stalling. When I told him he had a viral infection, he shook his head and said, "No, that's just old air." I asked what he meant. He said he inhaled expired oxygen and needed a fresh air cleanse. I tried to explain viruses. He actually said, "Doc, with all due respect, viruses are marketing." When I prescribed meds, he told me he would negotiate with his immune system instead. He came back 3 days later, barely able to stand. I didn't say "I told you so," but I thought it very loudly. Story 12. A woman came in convinced her appendix was broadcasting signals. Not hurting, not sore, broadcasting. She said every time she bent over she could hear messages coming from her lower abdomen. I asked if she meant gurgling sounds. She said no, messages. She wanted me to turn off the antenna. I explained what the appendix does. She interrupted and said she wasn't gullible enough to fall for biological cover stories. She asked if the government implanted something in her childhood vaccines. I told her no. She said, "Then why is my appendix talking?" It was gas, just gas. When she passed it loudly during the exam, she screamed, "That's the signal." I pretended my pager went off and stepped out for a minute to laugh silently into my sleeve. Story 13. I treated a guy who came into the ER demanding a pregnancy test. This was a full-grown adult man with a beard that could have won awards. I explained briefly why he didn't need one. He insisted he did. He said his stomach was swollen, he felt tired, and he had a craving for pickles. He said he was either pregnant or possessed. I told him there were several other explanations. He demanded we rule out pregnancy first. I finally handed him the test just to satisfy him. He took it, came back 10 minutes later looking offended, and said, "Negative? How?" I said, "Because you cannot get pregnant." He said, "Never say never." I said, "In this case, absolutely never." Story 14. I had a patient who claimed her heart kept switching sides because she could feel it migrating. She said some mornings it was on the left, some mornings on the right, and once it was dead center like a compass. I asked if she meant chest tightness. She said no, her heart walks around at night. I performed an exam. Her heart was exactly where it should be. She insisted it hadn't moved yet today. When I pulled up a diagram to show her how fixed the heart actually is, she said, "That's your heart. Mine is more free-spirited." I told her that was medically impossible. She told me to stop limiting her potential. Story 15. A college student came in because he thought he accidentally shut down his liver. He partied too hard, woke up hungover, and decided his liver had turned off. He said he tried restarting it by drinking coffee and then lying flat like a laptop rebooting. When that didn't work, he came to us. I explained he wasn't dying, he was hungover. He demanded proof. I showed him his labs. He stared at the results and said, "How do I know these aren't a simulation?" I told him we don't have the budget to simulate anything. He nodded slowly, like that was the most convincing part of the entire visit. Story 16. A woman showed up convinced her pupils were malfunctioning. She said one dilated faster because it liked light, and the other one preferred darkness. She described them like pickier siblings. I explained uneven dilation can happen for many harmless reasons, and in her case, it was within normal limits. She refused to accept that. She held a flashlight to each eye repeatedly and said, "See, the left one is a morning person." She then asked if I could discipline the lazy pupil. I told her I was not running a motivational workshop for eyeballs. Story 17. I once had a patient insist that bones float. His exact logic, they're white, so they should float like a pool noodle. He had broken his wrist skateboarding and truly believed his bones were floating out of place. I explained the fracture. He said, "No, I think they're drifting." When the X-ray came back, he pointed at the image and said, "Is that the drifting or the floating?" I said, "It's the break." He said, "Well, that sounds less magical." I said, "It also sounds real." Story 18. A man came in convinced he had discovered a new bodily system. He said every time he sneezed, he felt something reset inside his soul. I told him sneezing releases pressure. He said, "No, it releases trauma." He demanded we run a full scan to locate his reset button. I explained that was not a thing. He said, "Then how come every sneeze feels like my brain just hit refresh?" I told him maybe because sneezing is intense. He told me I didn't understand high-level biology. Story 19. A woman swore her hair follicles were plotting against her. She said her hairline moved forward every night while she slept. She showed me her forehead. It was the same forehead she walked in with. She pulled out photos from 5 years ago and insisted her hairline was creeping down with sinister intent. I said hairlines shift naturally with age. She gasped like I'd told her a government secret. She said, "So you admit my hair is alive?" I said, "I admit it grows." She said, "Same thing." That was the moment I mentally checked out. Story 20. A patient once came in because he believed his sweat glands had gone on strike. He said he tried to work out and nothing came out, which meant his sweat glands were unionizing. I asked if he had been drinking enough water. He said hydration was a myth invented by athletes. When I checked him, he was extremely dehydrated. I told him to drink water. He said, "But that rewards them." I said, "No, that prevents you from passing out." He reluctantly drank half a cup and said, "Fine, but I'm not negotiating with them long term." Story 21. I once had a man swear up and down that his kidneys were shrinking because they were shy. He said every time he got nervous, he could feel them pulling away from society. I asked him to describe the sensation. He said, "It feels like they are backing up into my ribcage to hide." I explained kidneys don't move like that. He waved his hand and said, "Doc, you underestimate the emotional intelligence of the human kidney. His labs were completely normal." When I told him that, he leaned in close and whispered, "Maybe they're just hiding from you." I had to step out because I could feel myself losing the battle against laughter. Story 22. A patient came to the ER convinced he was leaking electricity. He kept touching his own arms and saying he could feel static juice escaping. I asked if he meant tingling. He said no, electricity, like sparks, draining out of him. He even tried to show me by rubbing his socks on the floor and touching the bed rail. Nothing happened. He frowned and said, "It leaked too much." "I'm empty now." I told him nerves, fire signals, not electricity that pours out like water. He argued that phones have electricity, and he holds his phone all the time, so maybe it seeped in. I told him his phone wasn't a charger. He nodded and said, "Not with that attitude." Story 23. A woman came in convinced she had untrained lungs. She said she didn't trust them to breathe on their own, so she manually inhaled and exhaled all day. When I asked her to show me what she meant, she took huge, dramatic breaths like she was acting in a stage play. I said, "Your lungs actually breathe without conscious effort." She said, "I prefer to supervise." I suggested she relax and let her body do its job. She said, "Last time I relaxed, I forgot to blink for a whole minute. Her husband behind her mouthed, 'Please help.' I told her everything was functioning normally. She didn't believe me. She said her lungs would cheat on her the moment she let go of control. Story 24. I treated a guy who thought his blood pressure cuff was stealing information from him. He refused to let us use it. He said the squeezing sensation was the machine, trying to read his memories. I explained blood pressure. He shook his head slowly like I was the naive one. He said, "I've seen movies. This is how they extract secrets." When I asked who they were, he said, "Anyone. Machines talk." I finally convinced him by showing him the inside of a manual cuff. He stared at it for a long time and whispered, "This is either very clever or very dumb." He still looked suspicious during the reading, like the cuff was plotting. Story 25. I once had a woman who believed the human body only contained 8 pints of thoughts. She said thinking too much drained the supply and she needed a refill. I asked where she got that information. She said she calculated it based on intuition and vibes. She came in because she felt mentally thirsty. I asked what that felt like. She said her brain felt dusty. I explained cognitive fatigue. She said, "No, this is thirst of the mind." She asked if we could top her off. I told her we could give her water. She sighed and said, "Fine. But that only fixes the brain's plumbing, not the thoughts." I nodded because arguing would have broken me. Story 26. I had a patient adamant that his spine was loosening. I asked what he meant. He said every time he bent over, he felt wiggle potential in his back. He believed his spine was held together by spinal Velcro that could detach if he stretched wrong. When I showed him an anatomical model, he pointed at the discs and said, "See, that's Velcro." I told him it wasn't. He said, "Then why does it make that sound sometimes?" The sound was cracking joints. He said, "That sounds like Velcro, Doc." I gave up and told him the Velcro was fine. Story 27. A woman came in absolutely convinced she had grown a third ear inside her skull. She said she could hear herself thinking too loudly. I asked if she had headaches. She said no, just internal volume issues. I tried explaining that people can hear their heartbeat, their breath, or even sinus movement. She gasped and said, "That's the ear practicing." She demanded a scan. The scan was normal. She stared at the results and whispered, "It's hiding behind the noise." She thanked me for trying and told me to stay vigilant for secret ears. Story 28. A man marched into urgent care holding a jar. He said his body was releasing too many toxins and he wanted us to store them. I asked what was in the jar. He said, "My sweat." He was collecting it. He said his pores were overachieving and he needed us to check if his sweat was weaponized. I said sweat cannot be weaponized. He said, "Not with that attitude." He asked if we could test it for aggression. I told him no. He said, "Maybe in Europe they test aggression sweat." I told him no country tests sweat for anger. He didn't believe me. Story 29. I once had a woman insist her stomach acid was evaporating. She said she could feel the space inside her abdomen getting airier. I explained digestion. She waved her hand and said, "Doc, I know when something has vapor energy." When I asked what her symptoms were, she said, "I burp and it feels hollow." I told her that was gas moving. She said, "No, That is the sound of absence. She refused medication because she believed it would lock the vapor in place. She left saying she would consult a gut psychic. Story 30. I treated a guy convinced he could run out of DNA. He said he had been shedding too much hair lately and assumed DNA was a limited supply that leaked out with every strand. He said, "If I lose too many hairs, I'll run out of code." I explained genetics. He shook his head like I was the one being naive. He said, "Doc, everything runs out eventually. Why not DNA?" I told him, because that's not how biology works. He said, "Well, that's a relief, but I still don't trust my follicles." I told him none of us do at his age.